Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to yet another Horus Heresy lore breakdown. We are now on book 12, 1,000 Suns. This is a rather interesting book, as it has a fair few suggestions about the 1,000 Suns, which leaves their motives, I suppose, to be kind of, on one hand, explained, and on the other, even more unclear than previously. After all, Ahriman quite literally opens the book by lamenting their current situation, and stating that the 1,000 Suns had always and would always be loyal. And considering the recent actions of Ahriman, that would seem like a somewhat odd statement. Granted, this was old Ahriman, right after he'd had his little accident with the Rubric Marines, so he might feel differently back then than he does now. Oh, and on that note, a little bit of a sidetrack here, but I really hate 40k Ahriman after reading 30k Ahriman. Because the 30k version is so much more interesting. He has an actual reason for what he is doing. He has a motivation. 40k Ahriman most of the time just does shit cause reasons. He's like, yes, I need this book, cause, book. And it's really obvious that he is usually being used by the author as just a villain, and Ahriman should be so much more than a villain. Restoring his legion should be his quest, and he should be willing to commit sacrifices in the name of restoring his legion. Now, there are very few things I liked about the Gathering Storm books, very few things. But that one scene, when the Eldar lady somehow magics back to life a couple of Rubric Marines and then throws them off into the ether, and Ahriman dives after them with a shout of "Brothers!" That was good. That is the Ahriman we need to see more of. Ideally speaking, I would love a storyline where Ahriman basically goes like, okay, so chaos is not working for me. I've been doing this shit for 10,000 years and I have gotten fucking nowhere. And then this random Eldar bitch comes along, snaps her fingers, and resurrects my brothers, and now she's with the Imperium. I would really love a storyline where Ahriman basically goes like, okay, fuck it, I'm gonna try the other side now. I'm gonna fight for the Imperium for a while, and see if I can kiss enough ass to be put in contact with anyone that this Eldar lady's gotten in contact with, specifically Guilliman. That would be really genuinely cool. 40k needs a redemption plotline, I'm sorry, it does, because Chaos is heading a bit too far towards the territory of just being the cartoon bad guy, and they didn't used to be. Chaos used to have a lot more depth to it, especially in old Warhammer. Anyways, before I wander off on a complete fucking tangent, let us return to the point, shall we? And the point leads us to the planet of Agora. Now, this is a rather curious little world, and that is why Magnus and his legion is basically camping on it, despite the fact that Rust is going, "Oi, Magnus, hey, help!" All the whilst Magnus is sitting on his pretty little new rock and going like, yeah, I'll be right there, bro, it's just I found something really awesome here, it's like a pyramid, and it's made out of rocks and shit. And well, that is basically what he found. He found a giant mountain thingy that wasn't actually a mountain. Its proportions were far too perfect for it to have been created naturally. The Agorans themselves called it the Mountain of the Dead, or the Mountain Who Eats the Dead. 1 out of 2, the Imperial translation is a bit wonky on that one. And hey, that in and of itself wouldn't be anything like super interesting. The Imperium has come across all kinds of ruins of ancient long-dead civilizations all over the place. The galaxy used to be quite heavily populated before, you know, the Necrons and that whole worm, the heaven things, and the Eldar and the Orcs and the... You get my drift. It's not populated now. What was interesting, however, was that this giant pile of magical rocks could cancel out psychic powers. Now that was exceedingly unusual, because there is practically nothing that can actually do that. The only things that can really do so is either an opposed psychic power, and even then, you're not really removing the presence of psychic powers, you're simply cancelling one out with the other. Whereas this mountain literally was a complete and utter anathema to any form of psychic powers. Even Magnus's considerable talent was not enough to overcome the pyramid's dampening field. Another interesting thing was, this apparently stretched across pretty much the whole goddamn planet, because, you see, Agora was surrounded by the roiling tides of the warp. It would, generally speaking, be a planet where you expected basically braying mutants to live, wandering across the plains, screaming at each other. And instead, what they find? A perfectly normal human civilization, except for that strange mask fetish, which we'll get to in a moment, but that should not be the case. At the very least, mutations should be exceedingly common, and psyches as well should pretty much be everywhere, and yet, nothing zip nilch nada null zinch. Not a damn fucking thing. And considering Magnus and his son's over-fondness of the warp and mysteries, you can imagine he was rather intrigued by this. This led Magnus to treat the locals with a surprising and unusual amount of respect, and allowed them their fancies. For example, the Agorans was willing to lead Magnus into the mountain, but his legion was to refrain from going in there. The leader of the Agorans referred to the place as a holy place, and naturally outsiders were not welcome. They made an exception for Magnus because, well, he's probably the closest thing to a god any of them have ever seen. And this is where we come across a really, really interesting and key feature of the Thousand Sons. So I'll lead into this with their obsession of rituals, of numbers, of the old meanings of things. For example, they had been issued with the new assault cannons, but instead of calling them assault cannons, they had decided to keep the old name of Reaper Cannon. As for why they decided to keep the old name, well, it was simple, really. Reaper Cannon had more significance. And it had better numbers. It consisted of 6 letters, 3 vowels, and 3 consonants, and so its number was 9. And since the Thousand Sons Legion were organized into 9 fellowships, that meant that the Reaper Cannon was a natural fit for them. They really are quite obsessed with their numbers and their rituals, and here's the thing. This doesn't have to be a bad thing. Understanding the warp doesn't have to be a bad thing. It is when you think you understand all of the warp and that there is nothing it can teach you that things start getting dangerous. The warp is, by its very nature, extremely dangerous, even to those most learned in its ways, and how should I put it? It's like a tamed lion at best. It might obey your commands 99% of the time, but there is always a certain chance that it's not going to obey your next command. And this is the problem of the Sons. They are arrogant beyond belief. They are utterly convinced that they and only they have figured it all out. They know the answer to the galaxy's mysteries, and they have the answer, the definite truth. And so, when the Agorans call their valley holy, Thousand Sons dismiss it, because after all, they know the true meaning of holy. It means uninjured, pure, and is nothing to be feared, not understanding that there are powers out there in the galaxy that have a very different understanding of the word holy. And since, of course, the Thousand Sons know best, they decide to enter the valley after Magnus. And, bearing in mind, this is after Magnus himself has also told them to not enter the valley. This is quite interesting, because, generally speaking, a legion takes the word of their Primarchs rather seriously, and yet here, the Thousand Sons blatantly go against the word of Magnus. Now, of course, they had a reason. They were worried about Magnus, and considering the local topography fucks with their psyche rather drastically, that is not exactly strange, but still, this comes from a place of arrogance. Ahriman and the rest of his fellows know best. Therefore, if the Primarch is in danger, surely they must march out to rescue him, regardless of whether or not that goes directly against their Primarch's orders. It's not the kind of thing you would see in most legions. Now, speaking of Ahriman, he is a very, very interesting little chap, isn't he? Because he seems to have a better grasp on the limitations of the legions than most. He seems to have maintained a certain level of, should I say, down-to-earthedness. He has a bit of a more of a humble bearing, and he understands that if the Thousand Sons become overly reliant upon their powers, they are no longer a tool, they are a crutch that the Legion becomes reliant upon, rather than something they can themselves utilize. He muses that there might even be a point where they could become slaves to that very same self-power, and as such, he makes a point of constantly trying to enrich himself when it comes to knowledge. In Ahriman's own words, he is always the teacher and always the student. This is far more of a correct way to go about dealing with the warp, assuming that you know something, but never everything. Unfortunately, however, Ahriman is treated not with ridicule or anything. He's far too important and too accomplished within the Legion for that word to be accurate, but they do view him as a bit of an eccentric. For example, Ahriman insists on cleaning his bolter the good old-fashioned way, while many of his comrades will use their psychic powers to do so. Seeing the idea of cleaning one's own weapon with one's own hands as something faintly ridiculous, as far as they are concerned, their power is as common and natural as a normal man's hands. You wouldn't ask somebody to clean their weapon without their hands, would you? And again, this kind of proves Ahriman's points, doesn't it? If they're this reliant on their powers for the smallest thing, what would happen if they lost their powers and had to clean their bolters by hand? Granted, it's kind of a poor example because every Astartes is literally mind-programmed to understand how to do this, but you get his point, don't you? To return to the Thousand Sons wandering up the mountains, however, they eventually arrived at the valley, the entrance into the mountain, where the Agoran tribesmen were gathered in some sort of ceremonial procession. They were beating drums and doing what savages usually do when they howl at the moon and that kind of nonsense. Which, again, struck the Thousand Sons as a bit odd, because this wasn't a part of their usual rituals. There was no suggestion that this was anything that they normally did, so clearly, it must be some form of secret ritual that is done only at the mountain. And the Sons were getting a little bit worried. Bear in mind, the Sons are fully aware of the fact that demons are a thing, and this did look a wee bit suspicious. Especially considering the fact that the Agorans had a very peculiar little fetish. Every single one of them wore a mask that they never ever removed. Huh, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? I seem to remember some other heretical place that also had much that same tradition. Probably just a pure coincidence. There was, however, one thing that was even more interesting than the savages howling at the moon, namely two ginormous statues that looked like titans. In fact, they were the size of a titan and even taller, although very, very slender. One of the captains of the Thousand Sons put forth the idea that they might be Eldar, and everything considered, yeah, that seems pretty likely, although there would be one small distinction. These, in all due likelihood, were not Craftworld Eldar constructs. These were ancient Eldar constructs, meaning before the fall. Which means this mountain has been around for a very, very long time indeed. A bit creepy that, seeing two Eldar Wraith constructs the size of titans standing by the valley, but hey, there were happy news as well. Magnus had not been sacrificed in some kind of hellish bullshit or ritual. He was just fine. He had been inside the mountain along with the leader of the locals, a man by the name of Yatori. And he was rather displeased seeing a cohort of Thousand Son Terminators in the very place he had forbidden them to be. Odd how that tends to work out, isn't it? And Ahriman, understanding that he's been a naughty boy, prepares his tight, ripe little buttocks for a proper spanking, and Magnus does indeed promise him one. Fortunately for Ahriman, Magnus was a gentle spanker, and in reality, no real damage had been done, yet he was oddly forgiving, though then again, considering he had to take his complaints to Magnus, of all people, maybe oddly is not really the correct term here. Anyways, Magnus revealed some of his intent to his sons during a secret meeting. A very secret meeting, by the way. They even used special fancy pants magic to make sure that nobody could spy on them in any way, whether psychic or technological. Which is rather fancy. It almost sounds like they popped their little pyramid into the warp for a moment there, which is frightening in and of itself, but hey, details. Where he explained that this new world held the key to some great work that Magnus was currently undertaking. Additionally, he gave his 1,000 sons a mission, I guess you could say, in a long-standing plan of his. It was Magnus's dream to make the psychic powers that his legions so enjoyed not a mark of stigma or something unnatural, because the 1,000 sons were not exactly trusted during this particular period. Actually, let me touch upon that real quick. So, when Magnus first arrived at his legion, it was dying to practically dead. It had a rather nasty problem with sudden, spontaneous, and lethal mutation that would turn a legionary into a massive writhing ball of tentacular nonsense at the snap of a finger. This, obviously, was a little bit of a problem for the long-term survival of the legion. You know, randomly officers exploding into goblets, or random legionaries turning into horrifying bundles of tentacles that would roll down the hallways of their spaceships while singing Killing Me Softly was not good for morale or the long-term survival of the Legion. Magnus fixed this, and we'll get into precisely how later, but obviously, their legionaries randomly turning into gibbering monstrosities did not do much to endear the 1,000 sons to their fellow legionaries, not to mention the fact that they were all psykers, which, although how should I put it? The dislike and the distrust of psykers in the 30k world is not quite as profound and complete as it is in 40k. It's far more subdued. It is understood by the vast majority of the masses that psykers are necessary. They might not like them, but there's no way around them either. In 40k, psykers are a nebulous term, very much so interchangeable with witches and warlocks. The average Imperial citizen might know what an astropath is, but he might not necessarily know that he is a psyker. And obviously, this distrust of psykers was something Magnus wanted to fix. He figured he could do so gradually by teaching humanity that there is nothing to fear from psychic powers, that everybody could learn to use their gifts. And he was going to do that through his legion. He had pulled a fair bit of strings to get large numbers of psychically talented Remembrancers assigned to his legion. After that, he had put on a ruse. He had not directly ordered, but encouraged his legionnaires to be cold and to a degree dismissive of the Remembrancers. Like so many other legions, they would don the mantle of normal legionaries, mistrustful of these poets and musicians. But now, however, Magnus reckoned that enough time had passed for the legionnaires to don the mask of friend instead. He specifically ordered the legionaries to do whatever it would take to get close to these Remembrancers, whether they had to pretend to be grudging admirers or show acts of genuine kindness and friendship to them, because he wished to pair the Remembrancers with the highly tutored 1,000 Sons and teach these people, first and foremost, that not only were the 1,000 Sons not monsters, not dangerous or mutinous in any way, they were cultured warrior poets. Knowledge was their foremost value, and as such they had much to share with Remembrancers. The ulterior motive was a test. If the 1,000 Sons could teach Remembrancers how to properly deal with their powers, and also make these Remembrancers, who would of course would be spreading their stories wide and far, utterly convinced that the Thousand Sons were too harshly judged. They were in fact nothing, evil or dangerous, they were just misunderstood. That would obviously be of great value to Magnus, as of course before he could teach anybody about using their psychic powers, he first had to teach them that the psychic powers were not something to be afraid of. And speaking of Remembrancers with psychic powers, one of them is rather interesting, a young lady by the name of Callista, who apparently has the gift, quote-unquote, of seeing the future. I say gift, quote-unquote, because if she doesn't let it out, quote-unquote, by writing it down or drinking herself into a stupor, her head basically starts exploding, and she falls into a fugue state, driven only by good old-fashioned pain, suffering, and miserableness. Not really all that positive when you come to think of it. She is interesting because she, apparently, is more powerful than Ahriman. Now, the Thousand Sons functions in a rather interesting fashion. Whoever is in charge of the lesser legions, the chapters, etc., is dependent upon their brotherhood's preeminence within the Greater Legion. For example, Ahriman's cult had been preeminent for a very long time because they were able to read the future. However, these days he was unable to do so with any real accuracy. No surprise there, considering what he might see if he were to peer into said future. And the Furia, the more aggressive and bellicose, they were in ascendance. I wonder why. Ahriman. The hints were there, my boy, but you couldn't see them apparently. Anyways, Ahriman could not see into the future, and yet this lady had a vision of Prospero burning, and it burning to the sound of howling wolves. Now that is very interesting. So somehow, this young lady's ability to see the future was in one way more powerful than Ahriman, but also, well, nowhere near as controlled, so whether or not you could really call it more powerful, well, that is up for debate. Especially as said lack of control was to bite her and the Thousand Sons rather ferociously in the buttocks. She had scrawled thousands upon thousands of times on various pieces of paper that the wolves were coming. When she brought this to the attention of the Thousand Sons, they were kind of confused, like, the wolves are coming, what does that mean? Oh wait, we've been ignoring Russ for ages now while he's been yelling at us to come over and help fighting. Meanwhile, we've been sitting here on our happy little asses, doing, well, diddly dick nothing except looking at a giant mountain. He might be pissed at us, and, wouldn't you know it, a small armada of space wolves was about to appear in orbit above the planet. Now, of course, that was the wolves coming, badum-tish, but that was not what she was referring to, was it? We'll get back to that, though. Don't worry. We will most certainly get to it. There was a couple other psykers attached to the Remembrancers of the Legion as well. One by the name of Lemuel, who was an etheric reader, which essentially meant he could read people's auras, and rather interestingly, this was a talent he apparently gained from reading old books. Now, whether or not this means that anybody could become an etheric reader is unclear. It is suggested that Lemuel has a little power, suggesting that he might be a very low-level psychic, and that is why he can do this, rather than this being any kind of learned trait, but nevertheless, it is rather interesting. And another lady has, I don't remember the name for it, but when she touches an object, she can know its history. And interestingly enough, she's also able to decipher the history of non-human objects. For example, she touched the helm of what was apparently once a howling banshee, and she was able to understand the concepts, like this was a warrior, this was worn by multiple generations of Eldar, and so on, which is quite interesting because, of course, the Eldar language, their thought structure, etc., is very, very, very different from that of humans. So the simple fact that she could, how should I say it, make the leap of logic required to understand that a banshee is a warrior is quite interesting. Now, she didn't grasp the more subtle meanings behind the idea of aspect warriors, or why banshees in particular are banshees, but nevertheless, that is more than I had expected that she would understand. And now I shall bother you with an ad break, because I am a horrible, horrible human, and I imagine this book is gonna be, maybe a three-parter, so I might as well do out while I'm at it. And now, so whilst rubbing my hands, let us move on to Ahriman's talk with Lemuel, because this is rather interesting. As first and foremost, it gives us a bit of insight into how the Thousand Sons views the warp. They refer to it as the Great Ocean, and they use the ocean metaphor as a way of explaining it to the mere mortals. And, amongst other things, it explains to them that there are predators in the Great Ocean, just like in any ocean, and these can of course pose a threat to anybody traversing the tides of the Great Ocean without the correct level of understanding and protection. Which, that isn't wrong. The only problem is that the Thousand Sons have not yet realized that there are not merely predators in the ocean itself is a predator. And the Sons are blissfully unaware of this truth. In fact, they refer to the powers that dwell within the Great Ocean as the primordial creator, which is a rather fascinating turn of phrase, considering a certain cabal of knife-ears refer to that very same entity as the primordial annihilator. Rather substantial difference in terms there. The reason for this rather massive divergence is the fact that Magnus himself views the powers in the warp as... We'll get to this a little bit later, but for now, it's enough for me to tell you that he views them as non-sentient in the strictest meaning of the term. They can't really feel, they don't really have an agenda, they're not really even alive, they simply are, and he considers them to be, because they are essentially neutral, to be benevolent, because their very nature is to help and guide those who travel through the Great Ocean, without them themselves actually understanding or realizing that's what they're doing. It's a bit hard to explain, but think of it like this. The way Magnus sees it is that the primordial creators are essentially oxygen. We use it every day, and without oxygen we could not live, but oxygen has no concept of keeping us alive. It's not doing this to help us, this is just how it exists, and the fact that we can use it to fuel our lives it's not something oxygen is capable of understanding or has any kind of concept of, and never will. And that is how Magnus views the primordial creator. And this is going to turn out to be a rather disastrously optimistic classification. Another interesting little tidbit is that Ahriman claims that basically anyone can see the future. Now, obviously, he does not mean see the future in the most precise terms, he means them being able to sift meaning from the aether, essentially come up with a rough outline of what might happen in a sort of spirit sight. This might be comparable to, savages throwing bones at a carpet and going like, yes, the tooth there is pointing towards the south, that means that Magnus is pregnant. I don't know why I came up with that example. Never mind that, let's move on. Whilst, of course, Ahriman himself can not only discern a possible future, he can sift through the many thousands of possible futures and come up with the one that is the most likely, or alternatively, come up with the way to get a particular future to be the actual future. And it was apparently very, very easy for him to do this way back in the day when the power of his cult was considerably more powerful. He describes it as thus. It was as easy for him to see the future as for a normal man to know what would happen if he were to step off a cliff. It's a pretty good metaphor since, most people would know what would happen to them if they were to step off a cliff. Unfortunately for Lemuel, however, the only reason Ahriman could do this was because he was built to do it. It required the specially engineered brain of an Astartes to look into the future with quite this level of accuracy, and whilst Lemuel could eventually do so to a certain degree, he would never be as good as Ahriman was. Oh, and by the way, this is around about the point where the little lady with the scary dreams shows up with the note saying, "The wolves are coming on it," and wouldn't you know, the wolves were indeed coming. In fact, they were practically already there, as their fleet popped out of the warp right about around that very same time. It didn't come as any surprise to Magnus, who'd already felt them coming through the Immaterium, so he lined up his Astartes in an honor guard to receive them. And, by the way, there were 5 full fellowships on this planet. Some 6,000 Astartes just sitting around twiddling their thumbs, waiting for Magnus to get done diddling a mountain. Seems like a kind of a waste of Imperial resources, but oh well. And we'll get to the space doggies very, very soon, but before that, a note on the concept of Tutelaries. So Ahriman has a tutelary, as does the various captains. This is a minor warp entity, which they keep summoned in the world, although, well, in the world is probably incorrect. It is nearby in a unformed fashion, you could perhaps say. Other psyches might be able to see it, but to normal people, it is invisible. What precisely this is a little bit difficult to really nail down. Minor demon might be relatively correct, but at the same time, probably a little bit too hyperbolic, as this is not really one of the demonic entities. A demonic entity would have enough intelligence and enough agency of its very own to try and push the bounds of its power. The Tutelaries do not appear to do so. They are described to act as a form of tutor of a sort to the Thousand Son who has connected with it, who has bonded with it. Now, this bonding ritual in itself is rather interesting. I'm thinking that maybe the Thousand Son in question offers up a certain portion of his own life force in return for the services of the tutelary. Now also, the term teacher is probably a bit too broad for the tutelary as well, since it doesn't really teach anything directly. It's not like this kind of thing shows up and is like, okay, so if you want to fuck somebody mentally, this is what you do. It's more like a guide, a spirit animal is probably a more correct term than tutor in all due reality. And a practice partner. The tutelary allows the Thousand Son to practice keeping a warp entity on a leash and summoned, at least in a... Again, I find it hard to describe this, because the tutelary is there in our material universe, yet not quite there. It hasn't manifested fully, as if perhaps it is only bound to the Thousand Son, and therefore only the person who has bound it can really utilize it. Ahriman does mention that he can see the tutelaries of other captains, but I'm assuming he cannot communicate with them? It's a little bit unclear, but nevertheless, it basically sounds like they have summoned a minor warp entity, which could, if one wishes to be a little bit uncharitable, be described as a minor demon, which is disturbing, to put it rather mildly. And speaking of other worrying things, so we get an interesting little tidbit here, that every captain of the Thousand Sons was seconded to another legion to act both as an ambassador for their legion, to go like, hey guys, we're not all crazy psychics, and also for them themselves to learn from their host legion. The shortest secondment on record was the Space Wolves, ending after one standard Terran year, 360 odd days. That's pretty quick, but then again, the Thousand Sons and the Space Wolves. Yeah, I can't imagine they got along particularly well. And this one's rather juicy. Ahriman was seconded to the Wordbearers, where he made a friend of Erebus, of all people. Now, to be fair, Erebus was a very different person before he got kind of batshit, but that is still rather interesting, isn't it? Ahriman making a friend of Erebus, of all people. Like Ahriman himself said, There is no such thing as coincidence, eh? And now we finally get to the wolves, and, well, nobody can accuse them of not being able to make an entrance, as they basically combat drop right on top of the Thousand Suns camp, which, a remarkable way of making an entrance. Then, to really hammer home the point, Amlade Skarason's son wanders up to Magnus and orders him, in the least diplomatic way possible, to get his little red ass back up into orbit and finally wander off to help the Wolf King, who's been asking for his help for bloody decades now. Not quite that bad, but you get the general drift. It would appear that the Wolf King had sent the least diplomatic member in his entire legion full of undiplomatic assholes to go talk to Magnus, which went about as well as you could expect. If you use this kind of language with any Primarch, you're in for an ass-whooping. If you use this kind of shit with Magnus, you're in for having your soul ripped out through your anus. And Magnus makes a bit of an example of that this is a very possible outcome of this conversation, as he literally freezes time for a little while, just to show Amladai how badly the Crimson King can fuck his very existence up if he decides to push this for some mysterious reason. Luckily for our little wolf lord here, he quickly realizes that pissing off Magnus is probably not a great idea, and probably is not particularly conducive to his mission either, and so he bends over and presents ass for fucking, which Magnus very gentlemanly declines. There is one itsy-bitsy problem, however. Amladai has sworn a blood oath that he's not leaving until Magnus is coming along with him. Magnus, of course, does not give a fuck, but agrees to at least attempt to speed up his business on the planet, which, luckily for everybody involved, is about to take a turn for the interesting, as Yatari, the leader of the local perverts with their little masks, shows up and is all scared-like because apparently some kind of black gooish nonsense is creeping up the massive Eldar war constructs outside of their sacred cave. Now, this is going to be revealed to be a bit of a chaos infestation. I'm wondering, though, the Eldar usually don't make mistakes like this, building a gigantic F-off mountain to contain something, and then fuck up in containing it. Even more so, fuck up in creating the Guardians that is supposed to contain it, to the point where the Guardians themselves are actually corrupted. Which makes me wonder, perhaps, just maybe, the locals on the planet are not there from the Eldar side. They are not Guardians. Instead, and by the way, I'm really questioning the idea that the Eldar of all races would select humans to watch over their spot. Instead, I think the locals have completely misunderstood the purpose of the mountain. Now, in their ancient sagas and nonsense, there is a saying that it is the prison of some dark demonic entity, la-di-la-di-la-la. And they're like, oh yeah, one day it's going to burst out and everybody's going to be fucked. That's going to be real sad, but it's probably going to happen somewhere down the line and I'm probably going to be dead by then. Unfortunately for them, that is not actually the case. They have been giving dead people to the mountain, though, because the mountain eats them. However, giving corpses to a chaos-infested mountain sounds like an exceedingly bad idea. Beating drums that Ahriman himself noted would have been banned millennia ago due to their cadence is probably also a bad idea. I think that instead of keeping the monstrosities in the mountain, the tribespeople have been slowly but surely pecking away at the wardings guarding the mountain and keeping the nastiness in. Now, I doubt that the humans actually knew anything about this, but they might have been placed there by some less than scrupulous entities to eventually free the chaotic entity, or it might all be a part of Tzeentch's great plan, considering the conversation it had with Magnus in the end, but we'll get to that. Yatori came rushing off the mountain and went like, no, Magnus, bad shit's happening, you must come see Massa, but unfortunately Massa was busy dealing with the Space Wolves. Now, however, he is wandering off up the mountain with practically the entire goddamn Legion and their Terminator elites to have a look, whilst the Space Wolves tattle along as well. This, by the way, is where we get a really interesting piece of information about the Space Wolves. Apparently, their massive wolves are not actually wolves at all. Instead, they are some kind of gene-bred experiment. Apparently, the original settlers of Fenris brought these creatures in their original form and then played around with their genetic structure, eventually developing not only the wolves of Fenris, which turns out weren't actually wolves in the first place, maybe dogs or something, potentially. They also developed the Canis helix, which of course is used in the actual Space Wolves themselves. That is a rather fascinating little tidbit. And speaking of tidbits, this book really is a treasure trove of just interesting information about the Thousand Sons. Magnus refers to the power caught beneath the mountain as stagnant and dead. And considering the fact that we know it's warp power, that is very interesting. Magnus is apparently drawing a line in the sand, quote-unquote, between bad chaotic energy and good chaotic energy. He seems to think that they're actually two different things rather than one and the same. I think this is where the ocean metaphor really just kind of doesn't work anymore, because bad chaos energy isn't, stagnant, it isn't poisonous, it's the warp. And the warp is whatever the mind of he who perceives it thinks it is. There's no such thing as good or bad warp energy, there is simply warp energy. Oh, and by the way, so, they're wandering back up to the mountain where the giant guardians are, and their black goo is starting to spread out of the ground and being all like, ew, icky. They figured that's a bad thing, and, well, they're probably correct to be fair, but still, that's kind of racist. Black goo is like, must be evil spirits, but hey, details. Then, Yatori and his tribesmen get a brilliant fucking idea. And this is another reason why I think these little motherfuckers were actually placed there by Chaos and some long-lost Eon to try and wear away at the Eldar's barrier. Since they think, ooh, black goo, evil, must mean bad things, I know how to fix, let's all commit suicide! And so they do, with one tribesman slaying the other, and so on. And as you can probably imagine, stopping the spread of a demonic entity with blood was a great idea. There's a metaphor here about gasoline and fire, but frankly it's too bloody obvious. And to absolutely nobody's surprise, the giant war machine started moving and shooting. Who could have seen that one coming? Obviously, the power beneath the Earth was now, well and truly released, and that was going to be a bit of a problem for the Thousand Sons and the Space Wolves who'd wandered up there, as they were now fighting two Eldar Titans. But this is still Magnus we're talking about, and with the ancient blockades undone, well, he simply just destroyed one by waving his hands at it for a little bit. Because Magnus. But at least it did make him really, really tired, so that's a good thing, I suppose. In fact, the second one would have killed Magnus if it was not for a kind shield thrown up around him by the captain of the second company, one Phosis Takar. And this is rather interesting. So, Magnus had warned all of his captains and all of the various Thousand Sons that accompanied them to not draw upon the power of the warp, even if they could, because the power beneath the mountain, in his own words, was stagnant and dead. Now, obviously, he had already done that, but he's Magnus. He can, because, well, he's Magnus. Phosis Takar, however, he couldn't, and yet he did. And to make matters considerably more interesting, every single captain, with the exception of Ahriman and one further, partook in the power. This might actually be the very instant in which the Thousand Sons finally took one step too far and became irrevertibly corrupted. It's not for certain, there's no real evidence to suggest it, but you can't doubt that after this particular point, things did take a turn for the worse for the Thousand Sons. Magnus, having just barely escaped with his life, turned his power upon the second Titan, and with the aid of his captains brought that one down as well in a relatively short skirmish. A few dozen tanks were destroyed, and a downright uncomfortable amount of Astartes as well, but, well, they did just fight 2 Titans with infantry, so I suppose if anything, they were pretty goddamn lucky. Obviously, the next step, after just barely surviving the attack of 2 battle titans, was to continue down into the pitch-black hole and figure out just what kind of a nasty lived down there. Obviously. I mean, come on. What else would you do? Like, lifting off and glassing the place from fucking orbit? Anyways, Magnus went down there along with his captains, except for Phocis Takar, which, well, he wasn't doing too well at the moment. That kind shield had saved both of their lives, but it had been rather harsh on his psyche, to put it mildly. And so Magnus and his merry band wandered down below the mountain, where they found tentacles. Not even kidding, we are actually going there. Thousands of graspy, slimy, slippery tentacles which attack the Thousand Suns and picked them up to cuddle them most viciously. We have actually had a scene of tentacle rape in 40k, people. I just want everybody to realize that and hammer that fact home in their brains, because this is important. Don't ask me why, but trust me, it is. And boy, oh boy, does it get interesting right around here. Not for the reasons that you are immediately imagining. Instead, we get another really good piece of information about Magnus. Magnus was taught by his father not to delve too deeply or greedily when he was back on Terra, before he was sent off back to Prospero to rejoin his legion. He was even given a special tutor to make sure that he really did understand that he shouldn't be fucking with the warp. Unfortunately for Daddy, however, Magnus very quickly decided that he was way smarter than his tutor and his daddy, and so practically the moment he stepped foot on Prospero, he decided he was going to disobey Father. Now, to be fair, he did at the very least think about it, but in his mind, his legion was dying, and yes it was, the flesh change was not treating them particularly gently, and he had scried that the fate of his legion lay in the claws of some malevolent warp entity. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. He described this entity as one that the Emperor had had dealings with before, but had not dared to face. This entity might literally be Tzeentch himself. And Magnus figured, yeah, I can take him. Magnus, my boy, my lad. Your daddy looked at that and went, nah, I'm gonna try trickery on this one. And you figured, nah, I can take it. Well, how did that work out? We're gonna find out, aren't we? Magnus himself was entirely sure that he had defeated the creature and arrested the fate of his legion away from what was probably literally Tzeentch himself. And as for the validity of that claim, we are going to be visiting that particular point in great detail further down the line, but we don't want to dump too much information on you right off the bat. Currently, Magnus is having a nice little conversation with the tentacle monster, because why wouldn't you stop and chat with the tentacle monster? I mean, really, we are not savages here, and it doesn't seem too hostile, so might as well have a little bit of a chat with it. As for what the tentacle monster said to Magnus, well, I'm gonna make you wait for that, because I'm a pretty bad person. Until next time, I have been Arch, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.